My name is Johannes T, and welcome. This is the story. This is The Dragon's Treasure, originally published September 3rd, 2020. An ex-knight getting on in years makes a dangerous annual pilgrimage. The content warnings apply. Oh, Mariella said softly when she rolled over in bed and saw Goethe on her feet. Standing in the centre of their small bedroom, Goethe had already pulled her chain on over her head and was now in the process of fastening the studded plate of her jerkin around her waist, pulling the belt taut to settle it properly on her body. Is it that time of year already? The daffodils are in bloom, Goethe said, picking up her braces and beginning to fasten them onto her arms. In her youth, in service to the city, she had worn this armour every day, as a guard and as a night protector, but she was long retired from such business now. Her limbs were too tired and too old to stand the daily march about the castle's walls, let alone anything else. But today she would wear her armour, as she did every spring. You needn't go yourself, Mariella said in a quiet voice, and Goethe turned to look at her wife where she curled comfortably beneath the sheets, looking up at Goethe with her beautiful eyes half-lidded still with sleep. Mariella had never cared for early mornings, and Goethe stepped forward on silent feet, gently cupping Mariella's cheek, and Mariella leaned into the warmth of Goethe's palm, made rough with decades of holding a sword, and stained by a decade longer of brewing potions and making poultices. What good are our apprentices, if you would not trust them with this? What good is an old woman? Replied Goethe. If she would have a youth of 19 undertake a risk, she would not. You aren't so old, Mariella mumbled, her eyes falling closed, no matter that she tried to keep her best to keep her head. It was scarce even light outside. You have much to live for. I am holding everything that matters in my hand, Goethe agreed, still cupping Mariella's cheek as she slowly fell back upon the pillow. I shall return tomorrow morning. You'd better, Mariella mumbled, and Goethe pulled away. It would be a fine day when the sun rose fully above the horizon, and she wanted to be well out of the city by that point. Taking up her belt and putting it about her waist, making sure her dagger was in its scabbard, she made her way into the other room, picking up her satchel and putting the kettle on for the fire, that Mariella would have warm stew awaiting her when she rose for breakfast. It's spring again, Montebello, she told their horse as she came out into the yard, already saddled as he was, and Montebello looked at her for a moment, pensive, before he bent his knees slightly and allowed her to climb atop his back. Picking up the reins, she looked at the house she and Mariella had built together all those years ago. She looked at Mariella's beautifully kept herb garden, at the crystals hanging from their windows, and thought about her wife still asleep in their bed. She always did this before she set off for this annual pilgrimage. She took in their home together, and committed its every detail to memory. She prayed it would not be the last time she would do so, and set off. Riding so early as she was in the morning, there was no one in the streets to see her as she passed by, which was how she preferred it. She had some ride ahead of her over the plains known as the Sweetlands, before she made it to the mountain, and she spent the day in pensive silence, passing no one on the roads. She stopped twice along the way, once to collect some nasturtiums growing by the side of the Pink River, for the sake of their petals and their roots, and once to fill her water skein and eat some bread and butter. Goethe saw, on a path further down the plain, a hunting party moving out, no doubt performing the vital culls of some species in the nearby fairy woods. The deer, particularly, had been breeding over much this year, and she knew that the crown had been encouraging the people to add more venison to their diets, to cull their populations down before they destroyed every tree in the woods. The mountain loomed over her in Montebello. It was late afternoon by now, and rising in thick grey furls from the mountain's top, she could see swathes of smoke. Some people in the Sweetlands thought the Sweet Mountain was a volcano. Goethe knew better. As she and Montebello began to ascend the mountain, she checked her dagger in its holster, and felt the weight of her armour on her shoulders. Even just riding like so, it felt so very heavy. Had there really been a time, all those years ago, when it had felt like naught more than a second skin, made up of barely any weight at all? Could there really have been a time, long ago, when she was young? She was still graceful in her armour for now, but Mariella had been right. This pilgrimage would not be one she was up to pursuing forever, and perhaps not for many more years at all. Already her reflexes were slower, and while she still walked very silently, it would take only one unfortunate clink of chain upon chain, one creak of leather pleat against leather pleat, for her life to be over. Absolute silence was crucial. Goethe had found the entrance to the cave system in the Sweet Mountain when she'd still been just a little girl. Stumbling through the corridors, having run away from home over some argument with her sisters, she'd thought of living in the mountains forever. The dragon was even bigger now than it had been then. She still remembered vividly how it had felt, stepping into that great cavernous room, her feet making soft noise on the sandy floor, and looking with awe upon the pile of gold in the centre of the room, higher than her house had been at the time. It had glittered a bright, shiny yellow from the vents in the cavern ceiling, and she had seen 1,000 different types of gold coin, plates and platters, pieces of jewellery, busts, shields. When she had heard the rumble of noise down the great corridor, 20 times the size of the one that she had come through, she had thrown herself back into the narrow little hall she'd walked down, a corridor that now, as a woman, she would have to crawl through on her hands and knees. She had seen the dragon, a great beast with dark maroon scales, come into the room and curl itself around its pile of treasure, seeming to bask in its reflected light as a cat in a sunbeam. It had never occurred to her, even then, that she would steal any of the dragon's gold. It was not what occurred to her now. 40 years ago now, after a dragon had been killed on the Hourglass continent, somewhere in the vicinity of Nez, the healers there had discovered that the dragon's scales, owing to certain properties in their makeup and how magically rich they were excellent as reagents for all manner of healing potions and remedies. They allowed for the stabilization of very risky combinations of ingredients, particularly those best for an emergency. Blood replenishment potions, certain antidotes, and other mixtures that were vital in assisting a very ill or badly injured patient. They were vital, but rare. Creeping slowly down one of the corridors, she hugged closely to one of the walls and smelled the strange metallic scent of gold on the air as she came closer to the great cavern. The dragon was asleep. She could see its huge side, see its scales, which were the colour of undiluted wine, a thick red purple, a strange maroon. Where it rested, she could see its huge chest rising and falling, wrapped tightly around its treasure, that pile of treasure which grew larger every year. She had thought, as a child, that dragons ate gold. It seemed clear to her now that they did not. Goethe took her dagger from her belt and slipped slowly into the great cavern, her boots as silent as possible on the sand. She synchronized her movements with the dragon's deafening, growled snores, and found the first great pile of shed scales. Dragons had a decorative ruff on their chests of hard, horny scales that stuck out. They would slip free if they received a blow against their torsos at times, but every spring she had come to know, dragons, or at the least, this dragon, shed the scales from the chest and grew a new ruff. The pattern changed every year, she thought. Perhaps it was even done consciously. Cutting away the excess thin, filmy layer of skin that stuck between the hardened scales themselves, each of them a little bit larger than her palm in size, she began to carefully pack them into her satchel, pressed tightly against one another so that when she stood again they wouldn't rattle. She moved quickly, gracefully, and although her dagger moved swift and sharp through the shed skin and leathery, heavy scales, her body barely moved at all, to keep her armour from making any unnecessary sound. Goethe remembered the morning, decades upon decades ago, that she had thought to take from the dragon's cavern one of its shed talons or teeth, something to impress Mariella. How foolhardy she'd been, how madly unhinged when she had returned with a satchel of smooth, dry skin wrapped around the heavy scales. She'd scarcely known what it was she had. Mariella had kissed her so passionately, had all but wept with delight and joy, and the cures she had made. Satchel full, Goethe rose to her feet, and froze as one of her greaves creaked. In front of her she could see the dragon's huge head, large enough that it could swallow 5 of her without even chewing, where on every exhale, between snores, smoke rose up from its huge nostrils. Its eyes opened. She had never looked into the eyes of a dragon before. Very few people alive had. The people at the Draconic Church said that dragons had golden eyes, but she had never before now thought to consider what that meant. The dragon's eyes shone, each as large across as a cartwheel, unconscionably massive. They glittered as gold did, and the colour in them was not like the colour in humans' eyes, where the iris was scattered with pigment, but seemed in some way liquid and alive. Her dagger would not be able to pierce the dragon's thick hide. Her only hope if the dragon grabbed for her with its teeth, each of which were as large as the blade she carried herself, was that her armour would save her from the bulk of injury, that she could crawl to safety in one of the narrow corridors, and that in some days Mariella would send someone for her. Goethe barely dared even to breathe. The dragon did not move an inch. For what felt like hours, and yet couldn't have been longer than 2 minutes, Goethe stayed frozen in place, half to her feet, and the dragon remained quite still, its chin laid upon the back of its folded claws, its gaze fixed on her. With every exhalation, more smoke rose slowly from its nose, and she could smell the smoke, more like the result of burning sulphur than wood smoke. She could glean no expression in its face, although it was preached that dragons were intelligent, and carried in them more wisdom than the gods. It just stared at her, staying so very still she could almost believe it was still asleep, but with its eyes open, like a fish. Hesitantly, keeping the satchel tightly gripped against her side, she took a step back. Dragon didn't move. She took another. She took another. Impassively, it watched her as she made her way back to the wall, her heart beating so hard she could feel it in her throat. And when she fell back into the corridor, she stumbled, but then sprinted as fast as her old legs could carry her back out to the mountainside. Every part of her body in that aftermath ached. She stumbled, clumsy, down to where Montebello was waiting for her, slinging the satchel onto its back, and apparently sensing that she was struggling, he knelt to allow her to climb into the saddle. She didn't even need to lead him forward. She fell forward in the saddle, pressed her face against the hair of his mane, and let him choose their path back down the mountainside. Eventually, her breathing evened out, and her heart slowed in its fast, fast beat. The cold sweat remained on her body, clammy under her armour, and she tried her best not to shiver as she rode forward. Goethe did not stop for rest or water, and Montebello allowed it. As he tucked into the feast Mariella had left out for him, not expecting her wife or their horse home until the dawn, Goethe rushed into the house, where Mariella was sitting beside the fire, separating the petals from the stems of flowers for medicine. "Goethe," she said when Goethe came inside, her mouth falling open. "You're back so early. Are you—" Goethe grabbed her, held Mariella close to her, and buried her face in Mariella's hair. Mariella softened, hushing her as she wrapped her arms around Goethe's waist and leaned back to press their noses together. She touched Goethe's cheeks, her hair, her chin, kissed her so softly. "Oh, my love," Mariella said quietly. "You're home now. I have you." Mariella, with gentle hands, divulged her wife of her armour. It was the last time she would ever do so. The next spring, Helvete Turbin, who had been apprenticed to the town's 2 healers for some years, rode north in borrowed armour, thinking she would creep through the cavernous halls of the Sweet Mountain to steal into the dragon's cavern and take its shed scales. In the end, she did not need to. The corridor Goethe had marked for her to enter through had been blocked off some 15 feet down the passage by stacked stones. Helvete would have thought it was a natural collapse, if not for the shed dragon scales piled there, waiting for a healer to take them.